But anyway, but we're going to continue on today, Judges chapter 20. If you remember last week, we talked about the horrible situation. We talked about how, and I think this is worth noting. Oh, I did start it. Good. I think this is worth noting that when we think about a chosen special people of God, then sometimes we can say in one hand, yes, we understand they're still humans, but on the other hand, in our minds, we tend to elevate people, and we do this with people that are in ministry, like pastors or missionaries. We do this with different people in different professions. For example, like we think just because someone has risen through the ranks at an organization that they must be the best at what they do. No, it just means that maybe they're best for that position or they know somebody. But the point is, at the end of the day, we're all humans. We all have flaws. And it's important for us to recognize that even the chosen nation of Israel, who witnessed the power of God multiple times, on many occasions, was unable to resist the temptation of sin and eventually fell into what they did in chapter 19, into that behavior. And if you remember, I'm just going to recap it real quick because it's very important to what's happening today. It ended with the Levite cutting up his concubine in 12 pieces and sending them out to the rest of the nation. And that's where we pick up today, right after the people see this, they see this horrible thing, and they say, just imagine, we must do something, let's speak up. Chapter 20, verse 1 says, then all of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba. This is essentially just Dan is the northernmost point, Beersheba, so it's saying everyone from the whole nation. From the land of, then all of Israel from Dan to Beersheba and from the land of Gilead came together as one assembled before the Lord in Mizpah. The leaders of all the people of the tribes of Israel took their places in the assembly of God's people, 400,000 men armed with swords. The Benjamites had heard that the Israelites had gone up to Mizpah. Then the Israelites said, tell us how this awful thing happened. Right, because they still don't know the story. All they know is that they've received a human peace. So the Levite, which by the way, just as a complete upfront, would have been grounds enough to have this Levite put to death for what he had done to this body. But this again, they have fallen so far away from the things of God that they've forgotten what they promised to uphold. Anyway, so the Levite, the husband of the murdered woman, said, I and my concubine came to Gibeah in Benjamin to spend the night. True. During the night, the men of Gibeah came after me and surrounded the house, intending to kill me. True. And then they raped my concubine and she died. True, but with some omission, right? And this is often a point that a lot of scholars have pointed out, and a lot of other pastors really will harp on this point. Why did he omit that he was the one that sent her out? Right? Because that is what happened. And I think that can be a whole study in and of itself, but I don't think that that's the main point that I want to get at today. Although it does show you that even the Levites, the priestly caste, the ones who were supposed to be the best among them, were also fallen into this depraved attitude. They raped my concubine and she died. So I took my concubine, cut her into pieces, and sent one piece to each region of Israel's inheritance, because they committed this lewd and outrageous act in Israel, which is true. And now all you Israelites, speak up and tell me what you have decided to do. So now they hear the story. And what should the answer be? And it's funny because we actually do get a good answer, but the answer should be, this is outrageous. This is horrible. How could this happen here? I'm not sure if you heard, but over Christmas time, there was a terrible and tragic murder in Toronto where a bunch of young girls killed a homeless man. That sent a shock, rightfully so, through Ontario, if not all of Canada. How could that happen here? For the same reason this happened here in the city of Gibeah. Because they had forgotten who they served. They no longer had a higher authority in their life. They no longer served under the Lord, obeyed his commands. Instead, they did what was right in their own eyes. And as the quote that I presented last week, they felt that they were gods themselves. Because if you're not serving a god, then you are the god. And unfortunately, this has actually become a teaching in some progressive churches as well. But we are not. There is only one God. There's only one that we should serve. And in this response here in verse 8, it says, all the men rose up together as one, saying, none of us will go home. No, not one of us will return to his house. But now this is what we will do to Gibeah. We'll go up against it in order to in the order decided by casting lots. We'll take 10 out of every 100 from all the tribes of Israel, 100 from every 1,000, 1,000 from every 10,000, to get provisions for the army. Then when the army arrives at Gibeah in Benjamin, it can give them what they deserve for this outrageous act done in Israel. So all the Israelites got together, united as one against the city. They demanded justice. And justice immediately. It wasn't, okay, let's go home, get ready, go to war. It was, this is so urgent, the army will march ahead while we'll send people out to go get provisions for us. The army needs to get there right now. This has to be done. I love the sense of urgency because that is something that we need to adopt as Christians today. Do we have a sense of urgency to root that kind of evil out of ourselves or out of our churches or out of our communities? Or do we say, well, let's wait and let's be better prepared? Or do we just get it done? Then it says the tribes of Israel sent messengers throughout the tribe of Benjamin, saying, what about this awful crime that was committed among you? Now turn those wicked men of Gibeah over to us, that we may put them to death and purge evil from Israel. This seems right. They want to punish those who committed the crime. That doesn't seem that outrageous. But unfortunately, their response, the Benjamites would not listen to their fellow Israelites. They are Benjamites. We will stand by them despite their horrendous acts. And from their towns, they came together at Gibeah to fight against the Israelites. And once the Benjamites mobilized, 26,000 swordsmen from their towns, in addition to 700 able young men from those living in Gibeah. And among all these soldiers, there were 700 select troops. I spent way too much time trying to figure this out. I really don't understand the relevance of this passage. There were 700 select troops who were left-handed, each of whom could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. Now, the only reason I say that is I often say, when it seems weird, pay attention. So I did. I paid attention. But the left-handed thing never comes up again. The slings don't even come up. So I'm like, I don't understand what this was. Other than we knew that these were highly skilled troops. Then it says, Israel, apart from Benjamin, mustered 400,000 swordsmen, all of them fit for battle. So we have what seems to be, on paper here, 26,000 versus 400,000. This is going to be a landslide. Right? Israel should be able to go in there and just wipe the floor with them. But what I find interesting is God is going to have his judgment on the whole nation, even if it means using those who are sinning against him currently. See, the Israelites went up to Bethel and they inquired of God, right? So Bethel, of course, means the house of the Lord. That's where they had been keeping the temple, Bethel, Shiloh. They said, who of us is to go up first in the fight against the Benjamites? Now pay attention to the response. This is important. The Lord replies, Judah shall go first. Why? They never bothered asking why. Did they say Judah should go first because Judah is blameless and Judah's the best? So they should be the vanguard host of this army because they're the ones that represent me best. Or did he say Judah should go first because I have something planned for Judah? I'm spoiling the whole story, but hopefully you've all read this before. The next morning the Israelites got up and pitched the camp near Gibeah, and the Israelites went out to fight the Benjamites. And then they took up battle positions against them at Gibeah, and the Benjamites came out of Gibeah, and they cut down 22,000 Israelites on the battlefield that day. But the Israelites, of course, encouraged one another, and again, they took up their position. So, by the way, if you didn't catch that, they were repelled. They came at the city of Gibeah, and the city of Gibeah fought back and actually pushed back the Israelite force of 400,000 troops. But the Israelites encouraged one another and again took up their positions where they had stationed themselves the first day. The Israelites went up and wept before the Lord until evening. When they say went up, they're talking about go up to Bethel. They're going up to the temple. And they wept before the Lord until evening, and they inquired of the Lord. And they said, shall we go up again to fight against the Benjamites, our fellow Israelites? And the Lord answered, go up against them. Now, there's two things I want to ask. When they go and ask of the Lord, what do they do before they ask of the Lord? You may be rattling your brain going, I don't understand. That's because they didn't do anything. They just went up and said, God, what are we supposed to do? Go fight them, I guess. So once again, they show up. They say, well, we should have won. God, what are we going to do? Go up against them. So then the Israelites drew near to Benjamin the second day, and this time when the Benjamites came up from Gibeah to oppose them, again, they cut down another 18,000 Israelites, and all of them armed with swords. Again, Benjamin fights them back. Now you may be thinking, this is a weird story. Why does God seem to be helping the Benjamites? Aren't the Benjamites evil in this story? As I've said before, all villains, no heroes. At least they're finally inquiring of God, but this is the first time God's shown up in a while. But God will have his judgment. So the Israelites, along with the whole army this time, goes up to Bethel. And there they sat weeping before the Lord. They fasted that day until evening and presented burnt offerings and fellowship offerings to the Lord. And the Israelites inquired of the Lord. In those days, the Ark of the Covenant of God was there with Phinehas, the son of Yep, thank you. And the son of Aaron ministering before it. They asked, shall we go up again and fight the Benjamites, our fellow Israelites, or not? What was the difference in their attitude this time? They wept, they fasted. There was humility this time. They offered sacrifices. They recognized, who are we? What are we haven't been doing this thing right. We need to actually go before the Lord, submit ourselves. They fasted and prayed. They brought the Lord what the Lord deserved. Now, and this is an important one for us today, because how many times do we go before the Lord and we say, God, where are you? God, why aren't you helping me? God, why aren't you doing these things? But when is the last time that it ever led you to stop, get on your knees, fast, and pray? Because that's what it took in order for the Lord to finally give them the response that they we're looking for. It says, so they finally went up. Shall we go up again and fight against the Benjamites, our fellow Israelites, or not? And the Lord responded, go, for tomorrow I will give them into your hands. Then Israel set an ambush around Gibeah. They ran around the Benjamites, and on the third day they took up positions against Gibeah as they had done before. Then the Benjamites came out to meet them and were drawn away from the city. They began to inflict casualties on the Israelites as before, so that about 30 men fell in the open field on the roads, the ones leading to Bethel and the other leading to Gibeah. While the Benjamites were saying, we are defeating them as before, the Israelites were saying, let's retreat and draw them away from the city and the roads. They were setting up a trap this time. And then all the men of Israel moved from their places, took up positions around Baal Tamar, and the Israelite ambush charged out of its place to the west of Gibeah. And then 10,000 of Israel's young able men made a frontal attack on Gibeah. The fighting was so heavy that the Benjamites did not realize how near disaster was. The Lord defeated Benjamin before Israel, and on that day the Israelites struck down 25,100 Benjamites. What's important about that number? How many showed up to fight? 26,000. And 25,100 were struck down that day, all armed with swords. Then the Benjamites saw that they were beaten. Now the men of Israel had given way before Benjamin because they relied on the ambush they had set near Gibeah. Those who had been in ambush made a sudden dash into Gibeah, spread out, and put the whole city to the sword. They were to pay for the crime that they had committed. The Israelites had arranged with the ambush that they would send up a great cloud of smoke from the city, and then the Israelites would counterattack. They were going to wait until the city had been fully sacked, so that way the Benjamites did not have sanctuary to fall back to. They see the great plume of smoke. The Benjamites had begun to inflict casualties on the Israelites. You'll remember this. We just read this just a moment ago. About 30. And they said, "We are defeating them as in the first battle." But when the column of smoke began to rise from the city, the Benjamites turned and saw the whole city was going up in smoke. And then the Israelites counterattacked. The Benjamites were terrified because they had realized the disaster had come on them. So they fled before the Israelites in the direction of the wilderness, but they could not escape the battle. And the Israelites who came out of the towns cut them down there. They surrounded the Benjamites, chased them, and easily overran them in the vicinity of Gibeah on the east. 18,000 Benjamites fell, all of them valiant fighters. And as they turned and fled towards the wilderness to the rock of Rimmon, the Israelite cut down another 5,000 men along the roads. They kept pressing after the Benjamites as far as Gidom and struck down 2,000 more. On that day, 25,000 Benjamite swordsmen fell, all of them valiant fighters. But 600 of them turned and fled to the wilderness, to the rock of Rimmon, where they stayed for 4 months. This is important. There's 600 men because of what's about to happen. In verse 48, the men of Israel then went back to Benjamin, not a city, the entire region, went back to Benjamin and put all the towns to the sword, including the animals and everything else. That means families, wives, all of their possessions destroyed. All the towns they came across were set on fire. This can seem pretty brutal, and I imagine so. And sometimes we think, well, thank goodness we live in a new age with God, and we get to live under grace. And yes, to that I do say amen. I'm so glad I get to live under grace. But we know that this kind of thing is not over. For those of you who studied the book of Revelations with us, you'll know that it's going to happen again. Because for any of us that are in the church, and I think it's become quite obvious to many of us, you can look around at our culture and say they have forgotten. They think themselves the gods. They do what is right in their own eyes. And we're seeing the same pattern of behavior happening again that has happened before. This is not new. We just have flashing lights now. The fact of the matter is, who do we want to be? We have a choice to make. We can either heed the warning of being hedonistic, following our impulses and what these things lead us to, or we can say, you know what, we serve someone greater than ourselves. We serve a God who loved us so much, he was willing to pay for all of our sin, all of our mistakes. And so I'm going to give the rest of my life to him. Or we can say, you know, Jesus did that thing. You know, maybe he didn't, but I don't really like doing the church thing. I don't really like all the rules. I don't really, you know, God wants a little too much from me, and I want to do these other things in my life. Now, maybe you don't use those exact words, but that's the exact attitude that we have whenever we end up blatantly in the face of God saying, you know, God, I know you have this rule for me, but I just don't feel like it today. It just doesn't fit. We have to recognize that eventually the judgment of the Lord will come. And it comes on everybody. And no one will be spared. Everyone will have to pay what they owe. I've said it before, and when we went through John, and I'll say it again, one of my favorite verses is, the wages of sin is death, because so often we like to think, we don't think of what's going to happen to us as something that we have earned, but a wage is something that you have earned. It's something that you've worked for and done. So what are you working for? What are you doing? Where are you applying your life? And the worst part is that this isn't even the end of this story. There's still a whole other chapter where they still don't learn and they still don't understand. And we'll get into that next week.